Somewhere beneath the sands of southern Egypt, over 5,000 years ago, a king was buried with everything he needed for eternity. Servants, treasures, symbols of absolute power. And yet today, we're still not entirely sure what to call him. That's the strange truth at the very beginning of Egyptian history. The man who may have united two kingdoms into one of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known left behind a name that history itself seems to have scrambled. If you're settling in to fall asleep to this one, that's exactly why I make these. So do me a favour, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is right there. I love seeing it. Someone in Sydney starting their morning coffee while someone in Chicago is drifting off at midnight, all listening to the same story at the same moment. It's a small reminder of how connected we all are, even 3,000 years removed from the story itself. And if you enjoy these, the best way to support the show is to follow it on Spotify. Listen there, and if you've got a spare moment, leave a 5-star review. The link's in the description. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Now, back to Egypt. For centuries, ancient historians told a clean, simple story. A king named Menes united Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BCE, founded the city of Memphis, and became the first pharaoh of a unified nation. It's the kind of origin story you'd expect. Tidy, dramatic, with one hero at the centre of it all. The problem is, when archaeologists actually went looking for Menes, physically searching tombs, inscriptions, seals, anything with his name carved into it, they didn't find him. Not exactly what they found instead was a king called Narmer. His name appears on one of the most famous objects in all of Egyptology, a ceremonial slate palette showing a powerful figure smashing an enemy's skull with a mace, wearing the crowns of both southern and northern Egypt. It looks for all the world like a founding king. A unifier. Exactly the kind of figure ancient historians described when they wrote about Menes centuries later. So are Narmer and Menes the same person? Two names for one king, the way pharaohs often had multiple titles? Or are we looking at two different rulers, separated by years or even generations, whose stories got tangled together as they passed down through oral tradition and priestly records? This is one of the oldest identity puzzles in archaeology, and honestly we still don't have a definitive answer. What we do have is evidence, fragments of it, tombs at a place called Abydos holding kings whose names barely survived, ivory labels with faded hieroglyphs, seal impressions pressed into clay thousands of years ago that still carry the marks of officials serving a king we can barely name, damaged monuments, contradictory king lists written centuries after the fact by scribes who may have been working from legend as much as record. Piece by piece, historians and archaeologists have been trying to reconstruct exactly what happened at the start of Egypt's First Dynasty. Who this king really was, whether he united Egypt through war, or whether that unification was already underway before he ever took the throne. Whether the name we know him by is even the right one. To understand how a founding king could become this uncertain, this contested, we have to go back even further. Before crowns, before dynasties, to Egypt as it existed on the very edge of becoming one nation. Picture Egypt, 5,500 years ago. Not the Egypt of pyramids and pharaohs. Not yet. This is Egypt before any of that existed. When the Nile Valley was less a nation and more a patchwork, dozens of small communities strung along the river like beads on a string, each one convinced it was the centre of the world. There was no Upper and Lower Egypt in the way we think of it today, two neat halves waiting to be stitched together by a single conquering king. Instead, there were regions, cultural zones, loose identities shaped by geography as much as anything else. Upper Egypt, the long southern stretch of the Nile, developed its own pottery styles, its own burial customs, its own way of organizing power. Lower Egypt, the wide marshy delta where the river fanned out toward the Mediterranean, developed differently, shaped by different resources, different neighbors, different pressures. These weren't kingdoms yet. They were more like rival dialects of the same emerging culture, similar enough to recognize each other, different enough to compete. And compete they did, because somewhere in this world certain towns started pulling ahead of the others. Hierakonpolis in the south grew into a genuine power centre, with evidence of large-scale construction, specialised craftsmen, and burials that show a widening gap between rulers and ruled. Naqada wasn't far behind, controlling access to gold routes and trade corridors that ran east into the desert. And Abydos, quiet, sacred Abydos, was already becoming the place where the elite chose to bury their dead, as if proximity to that stretch of desert meant something even before anyone fully understood why. These weren't villages anymore. They were emerging states in miniature, complete with elites who dressed differently, ate differently, and were buried with objects ordinary people could never hope to own. Imported stone vessels, fine ceramics, early hints of hieroglyphic symbols used to mark ownership and status. You can trace, layer by layer, the slow hardening of hierarchy, the moment when some families start having noticeably more than others, and holding on to it, generation after generation. Trade accelerated all of it. Goods moved along the Nile and out into the surrounding deserts, obsidian, copper, exotic stones, luxury items that meant nothing for survival, but everything for status. Agriculture, meanwhile, kept getting more efficient, producing surplus grain that had to be stored, guarded, and controlled by somebody. And once you have surplus that needs controlling, you have the raw material for kings. Ritual mattered just as much. Elaborate burials, ceremonial objects, symbols of divine or semi-divine authority, all of this appears well before any single ruler claims to unite the two lands. Which suggests something important. Unification wasn't a lightning strike. It probably wasn't one battle, one king, one triumphant morning when Egypt suddenly became Egypt. It looks far more like a slow convergence. Centuries of rival elites absorbing each other, allying, conquering, intermarrying, trading, until the boundaries between Upper and Lower Egypt blurred into something new. A single crown may have simply been the final, dramatic punctuation mark on a story that had already been unfolding for generations. And that is exactly where the trouble begins. Because if unification was a slow process, if power changed hands through generations of alliances, rivalries, marriages, trade deals, and occasional violence, then finding the one person who supposedly started it all becomes almost impossible. We want a clean answer, a name, a date, a king standing at the beginning of the First Dynasty, with a crown on his head and a declaration ready to go. The evidence does not cooperate. For the earliest kings of Egypt, we don't have biographies. We don't have royal diaries explaining what happened in the third year of a ruler's reign. We don't have speeches, laws, battle reports, or official maps showing exactly where one kingdom ended and another began. Most of the materials that could have preserved those things, papyrus, wood, textiles, leather, simply did not survive 5,000 years in most places. The Nile gave Egypt life, but its yearly floods, damp soil, insects, grave robbers, and later construction also erased an enormous amount. What survives is scattered, a broken piece of stone here, a clay seal there, a few tiny ivory tags pulled from a tomb chamber after millennia underground. A royal name scratched onto a vessel, sometimes clearly, sometimes so faintly that scholars argue over whether a sign is even there at all. Reconstructing the First Dynasty can feel less like reading history and more like trying to solve a giant puzzle after someone has burned the box, lost most of the pieces, and mixed the rest with pieces from 3 other puzzles. And the earliest pieces are especially difficult because writing itself was still new. By around 3200 BCE, Egyptians were beginning to use signs that would grow into hieroglyphic writing. But this was not yet the vast, polished system of temple walls and funerary books from later centuries. Early writing was experimental, compact, often practical. A sign might identify an estate, mark the contents of a jar, name an official, record a delivery of oil, or announce that an object belonged to a ruler. Sometimes a few symbols may carry a full royal name. Sometimes they may be titles, sometimes they may be both. That last part matters more than it sounds. Later Egyptian kings usually had several names, each connected to a different aspect of royal power. But in the earliest period, the naming system was still developing. A ruler might be identified by a sign associated with the falcon god Horus, placed inside a rectangular frame called a serek. The serek represented the royal palace facade. Above it stood the falcon. Inside it was the king's name, or what we think was his name. But even that apparently simple system can be frustrating. Some signs have multiple possible readings. Some were stylized so heavily that they look different from later versions. Others are damaged, and some kings may have used more than one name during their lives, or been remembered under a different name centuries later. Imagine trying to identify a modern president if all you had was half a signature, a seal stamped on a shipping crate, and a nickname written down by someone living 2,000 years afterward. That is roughly the kind of problem we are dealing with. The contemporary evidence, the evidence made while these rulers were actually alive, is precious precisely because it is so close to the events. But it is also frustratingly brief. Seal impressions are one of the most important sources. Officials pressed carved seals into wet clay to close jars, secure doors, mark storerooms, and control goods moving through the early state. When the clay dried, it preserved names, titles, symbols, sometimes whole sequences of rulers. These impressions are not grand monuments meant to tell a story for eternity. They are bureaucratic leftovers, the ancient equivalent of a label on a warehouse container. But bureaucratic leftovers can be gold for historians. They tell us that somebody was organizing resources, supervising labor, moving goods, and claiming authority across distances. Then there are small labels, often made of ivory, bone, wood, or sometimes stone. Many were attached to jars and other goods placed in royal tombs. A tiny label might record an event, an estate, a place name, a product, or a regnal occasion. Some show images alongside signs: a boat, a captive, an animal, a shrine, a ruler in ceremonial dress. These little objects may be among the earliest attempts to record royal activity, but they are not easy to read like sentences. They were designed for people already inside the system, people who knew the context. To us, 5,000 years later, they can be maddeningly compressed. A label may show a king smiting an enemy. Does it describe a real campaign? A ritual performance? An annual festival reenacting the king's victory over chaos? Possibly all three, in a world where politics, religion, and ceremony were not separated the way we separate them now. An image of a captive does not automatically prove a specific battle. A boat does not automatically prove an expedition. A strange animal may represent a foreign land, a royal title, or a symbolic claim to power. Early Egypt was creating its political language at the same time it was creating its writing. Tomb inscriptions add another layer. At Abydos, especially in the royal cemetery at el-Ka'ab, excavators found graves linked to rulers at the beginning of dynastic Egypt. These tombs contained hundreds of objects marked with royal names: pottery jars, stone vessels, ceilings, tags, fragments of furniture and ceremonial equipment. In some cases, the names appear again and again, giving scholars more confidence that they refer to a particular king rather than a one-time official or an estate. But tombs are not neutral archives either. They were places of royal display. Everything inside them had a purpose. Goods could be brought from distant regions to demonstrate control. Imported materials could advertise connections. Symbols of conquest could make a ruler appear more powerful than he really was. A tomb tells us what a king and his court wanted eternity to believe. It does not always tell us what happened on an ordinary Tuesday in the Nile Valley. And then there are the spectacular ceremonial objects. Palettes, mace heads, carved ivories, decorated knives and other luxury items from the late pre-dynastic and early dynastic world. These are the objects that make the period feel vivid. They show kings larger than other people wearing crowns, striking enemies, leading processions, receiving tribute or standing beside divine symbols. They seem to offer exactly what we want, the first chapters of Egyptian history carved in stone. But they come with their own warning label. Royal art was never just reportage. It was propaganda before the word propaganda existed. The king is shown defeating enemies because that is what kings were supposed to do. He imposes order because order was the whole point of kingship. He is bigger than everyone else because he is not merely a man in the image. He is the centre of the world, so when we see a ruler holding a mace over a defeated foe, we have to ask two questions at once. Did this commemorate a genuine military victory? And was it also a timeless image of royal power, meant to show that this king, like every proper king, defeated disorder wherever it appeared? The answer may be yes to both, but the object itself rarely pauses to explain. Now compare these contemporary fragments with the sources written much later. Centuries after the First Dynasty had ended, Egyptian scribes compiled king lists. Temple inscriptions recorded sequences of rulers. Historians writing in Greek, including Manetho in the 3rd century BCE, described Egypt's earliest dynasties and gave the founder of the unified kingdom a famous name, Menes. This later tradition is enormously important. Without it, we would not even know how ancient Egyptians themselves organized their deep past. But it is not a direct window into 3100 BCE. By the time many king lists were written, the First Dynasty was already ancient history, as distant from those scribes as the medieval period is from us. And just as modern people reshape the past into neat stories about founding fathers, golden ages and national beginnings, ancient Egyptians did the same. King lists had political purposes. They could emphasize legitimate lines of succession. They could connect a reigning king to prestigious ancestors. They could skip rulers considered illegitimate, embarrassing, foreign, short-lived, or simply inconvenient. Sometimes they used different royal names from those found on contemporary objects. Sometimes they compressed complicated transitions into a smooth sequence, because smooth sequences make power look stable. This is why a missing name is dangerous evidence. If a king's name does not appear in a later list, that does not prove someone deliberately erased him. It might mean the king ruled briefly. It might mean his name was recorded under another form. It might mean the surviving list is damaged. It might mean a later scribe had incomplete information. Or it might mean the king was excluded on purpose. Deliberate erasure did happen in Egyptian history. We know that from later periods, when names and images were hacked from monuments. But absence alone is not proof of a conspiracy. The illusion of erasure can emerge naturally when the record is thin. One king survives on a handful of sealings, another survives in a later king list, but leaves almost no contemporary objects. A third appears under one name in a tomb, and another in a historical tradition. Put those gaps together, and it can look as though history tried to hide someone. Sometimes history really did, but often history did something even more ordinary and more cruel. It forgot. Not completely, never completely. A clay seal survives in dry sand. An ivory tag escapes the robbers. A broken inscription preserves 3 signs of a name. And 5,000 years later, those scraps become the only voices left from the dawn of Egyptian kingship. Which means that the first king of Egypt does not emerge from a single clear record. He emerges slowly, through fragments, through arguments over signs, through names that may belong to one man, 2 men, or a ruler remembered differently by different generations. And among those fragments, one name begins appearing with unusual force. Not first in later legend, but in the hard archaeological evidence itself. Narmer. But before we follow that name into the archaeological record, we need to meet the other candidate. The king whose name became so famous that, for centuries, he seemed to be the obvious answer. Menes. If you opened an old history of Egypt, Menes would probably be there on the first page. The first king. The man who united Upper and Lower Egypt. The founder of Memphis. The ruler who took a collection of competing Nile Valley communities and turned them into one kingdom. In the traditional version of the story, Egypt begins with Menes, almost the way Rome begins with Romulus. One man steps out of the fog, performs the founding act, and everything after him becomes history. It is a powerful story, maybe too powerful. The name Menes comes to us mainly through much later traditions. The most important source was an Egyptian priest named Manetho, who lived during the 3rd century BCE, more than 2,500 years after Egypt's First Dynasty began. Manetho wrote a history of Egypt in Greek, apparently organizing its rulers into the dynasties that historians still use today. According to this tradition, Menes was the first king of the First Dynasty, the ruler who brought the country together. Manetho's original book has not survived intact. That is another one of those frustrating little traps waiting in ancient history. We know his work through later writers who quoted, summarized, corrected, and sometimes contradicted him. It is like trying to reconstruct a lost documentary from reviews written by people who watched it hundreds of years later. Still, Manetho's account mattered enormously. He gave later readers a framework. 30 dynasties, a sequence of kings, and right at the beginning, Menes. Other ancient writers repeated variations of the story. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described a king he called Min, usually linked with Menes as the founder of Memphis. According to Herodotus, this king diverted the Nile, reclaimed land from the river, and built a city at the point where Upper and Lower Egypt met. Later writers added their own details. Menes became not just a conqueror, but a builder, an organizer, a man who imposed order on a difficult landscape. And Memphis was the perfect place for that memory. It stood near the point where the Nile Valley opened into the delta, close to the border between Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north. If you wanted a capital that symbolized union, you could hardly choose a better location. It was positioned between 2 worlds, the long, narrow river valley and the broad, watery fan of the delta. A city there could watch traffic moving north and south, collect goods, command labour, and announce that the king belonged to both lands. So the tradition makes sense. A king who united Egypt should found a city at the meeting point. A king who founded a city there should be remembered as the unifier. The story locks together neatly, maybe a little too neatly. Because the closer we get to Menes' supposed lifetime, around 3100 BCE, the more the evidence changes shape. The later stories are full of grand actions, unification. A capital river engineering. The beginning of the monarchy itself. But the contemporary objects from the earliest dynastic period do not clearly identify a king named Menes. That does not mean Menes was invented from nothing. It means we have a problem of names. Egyptian kings could have several names. The name used in a later king list might not be the one stamped on a jar sealing during the king's lifetime. A ruler could be known by a Horus name in one context, a birth name in another, and perhaps a ceremonial or abbreviated form in a third. Over centuries, scribes copied old traditions, translated names into newer forms, and tried to organize a past that was already unbelievably ancient. Think about the gap involved here. Menes, if he was a historical ruler, lived roughly 5,000 years ago. Herodotus wrote about him around 2,600 years later. Manetho wrote even later. That is a longer distance than the one between us and the builders of Stonehenge. Imagine if the only surviving account of your country's founding came from a scholar writing today about events in the early Bronze Age, using archives that were themselves incomplete, selective, and shaped by centuries of political storytelling. You would expect some confusion. You would expect names to blur. You would expect a complicated process to become a clean legend, and ancient Egyptians had good reasons to prefer a clean legend. A unified kingdom needs a beginning, not just a date, but a person. Egypt was a land of continuity. For thousands of years, kings presented themselves as guardians of Ma'at, the proper order of the universe. The Nile rose, fields were planted, temples received offerings, enemies were held back, and the king stood at the centre of it all. This system worked best if it appeared ancient, stable, and natural. A single founding king gave the whole structure a starting point. Before him, division and disorder. After him, the two lands joined under one crown. That story was politically useful. It made unity seem like Egypt's original condition, not something fragile that had to be repeatedly defended. It made later kings heirs to a sacred achievement. Every pharaoh who wore the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt could present himself as renewing the work of Menes, not necessarily by copying his exact actions, but by embodying the same idea: one ruler, one land, order against chaos. There is something very human about that. Nations love founders because founders make messy history easier to carry. Real political change is usually slow. It happens through trade, intimidation, marriage alliances, religious influence, military campaigns, local rebellions, and generations of people making decisions for reasons nobody writes down. But memory prefers the moment when everything changed. The handshake, the battle, the coronation, the one person who supposedly made the map look different. Menes may have been that kind of memory. The name endured because it answered a question later Egyptians wanted answered. Who made Egypt? Egypt, but memory is not the same thing as proof. We do not have a palace inscription from around 3100 BCE saying, "I am Menes, and I have united the two lands." We do not have a contemporary building foundation at Memphis bearing his name beyond dispute. We do not have an object from his reign that settles the question in the simple, satisfying way people would like. What we have is tradition, strong tradition, ancient tradition. A tradition preserved in king lists, repeated by historians, and tied to one of the most important ideas in Egyptian civilization. That gives Menes historical weight. It does not automatically give him a securely identified tomb, a confirmed set of contemporary inscriptions, or a biography. And this is where the mystery becomes genuinely interesting, because while later Egyptians remembered a founder called Menes, archaeology remembers something else. On ceremonial stone, seal impressions, jar labels and objects buried in the oldest royal cemeteries, another name appears with remarkable clarity. Narmer, Narmer. Unlike Menes, Narmer does not arrive mainly through stories written thousands of years later. He arrives through objects, through marks pressed into clay, names scratched onto pottery, ceilings from storehouses, fragments of stone that survived because somebody buried them, discarded them, or left them in places too dry for time to completely destroy. It is not much, at least compared with the evidence for later pharaohs. There are no giant pyramids with Narmer's name carved across their walls. No long royal autobiography telling us where he was born, who his parents were, or exactly how he came to power. The Egypt of around 3100 BCE was only beginning to create the bureaucratic machine that would later record every delivery of grain, every temple estate, every official title, and every royal command. But for this early period, Narmer is unusually visible. His name appears at Abydos in Upper Egypt at the ancient royal cemetery of el-Kab. It appears at Hierakonpolis, one of the great political and religious centres of pre-dynastic Upper Egypt. It appears at Nakada, another important centre farther north along the Nile. It has been found on pottery and seal impressions at sites in the Nile Valley and Delta. And, perhaps most surprisingly, it appears beyond Egypt itself, in southern Canaan, in what is now part of modern Israel and Palestine. That matters because a king's name is not just a name. It is evidence of reach. If Narmer's name turns up in several Egyptian centres, that suggests he was not simply a local ruler whose influence stopped at the edge of one town. His administration, his prestige goods, his agents, or at least his political identity had travelled. And when his name appears in southern Canaan, it tells us that early Egypt was already connected to a wider world of trade, diplomacy, extraction, and perhaps military pressure. This was not a sleepy kingdom sealed off by desert. The Nile was Egypt's great highway, carrying people and goods north and south. But the routes did not end at the delta. From there, ships and caravans could move along the Mediterranean coast and into the Sinai. Egyptian vessels, pottery, wine jars, oils, stone, copper, timber, animal products, and luxury goods moved through networks that had existed before the First Dynasty. Narmer inherited those networks, or helped bring them under royal control. At sites in southern Canaan, archaeologists have found Egyptian-style pottery, evidence of Egyptian activity, and in some cases Narmer's name. This does not necessarily mean he personally marched there at the head of an army, conquered every settlement, and planted a flag in the ground. Ancient royal symbols have a way of making every connection look like conquest. The reality may have included trade colonies, storage stations, diplomatic relationships, merchant communities, and local rulers trying to benefit from Egyptian goods. But whatever form that contact took, the message is clear enough. Narmer's Egypt was not small, and the way his name appears is important too. Narmer's royal name is usually written inside a rectangular frame called a serek. At first glance, it can look like a little box with decorative lines. But it is one of the most significant inventions in early Egyptian kingship. The serek represented the facade of a royal palace. Its lower portion was drawn with the pattern of a monumental palace wall, full of recessed panels and formal architecture. Above it stood a falcon. That falcon was Horus. To later Egyptians, Horus was one of the great gods of kingship, a sky god associated with the living king. The king was not merely favoured by Horus. In the oldest royal tradition, the king was presented as Horus on earth, the divine force that protected Egypt, defeated enemies, and maintained order. So when Narmer's name appears inside a serek beneath the Horus falcon, it is doing several things at once. It identifies a ruler, it identifies a palace, it identifies an institution, and it makes a claim that would shape Egyptian history for 3,000 years. This man is not just a powerful chief. He is a king in a sacred system. His authority has a divine face. Narmer's name itself is usually read as something like catfish, or perhaps striking catfish, depending on how the signs are understood. Egyptian writing in this period was still developing, and early signs could operate in ways that are not always perfectly clear to us, but the combination is recognizable. A catfish sign, followed by a chisel-like sign. Again and again on objects from this period, there it is, Narmer, enclosed in the royal frame, watched over by the falcon. That repetition is why he stands on firmer ground than Menes. Menes is a name carried by memory. Narmer is a name carried by archaeology. And that does not mean the two names must describe two different men. This is the central possibility. Many scholars identify Narmer as the strongest candidate for the historical ruler later remembered as Menes. He appears at exactly the right moment on the threshold of the First Dynasty. His name is linked with royal power across Egypt. His imagery, which we will come to shortly, is deeply concerned with the relationship between Upper and Lower Egypt. And his reign appears to stand immediately before, or perhaps overlap with, the reign of Hor-Aha, another king who is also sometimes proposed as Menes. Narmer fits the role so well that it is tempting to declare the case closed. But early Egypt is rarely that cooperative. We do not possess an ancient inscription saying, Narmer was also called Menes. No surviving object gives us that neat little bridge between the archaeological name and the later traditional name. The identification is an interpretation, though a very influential one. It rests on chronology, royal sequence, later king lists, and the possibility that Menes was a different form of Narmer's name, a personal name rather than the Horus name displayed in the Seric. There is another complication. Unification may not have been one event. Maybe Narmer brought together territories that had been moving toward unity for generations. Maybe he won a decisive conflict. Maybe he inherited most of a kingdom already built by earlier rulers and made the final claim of authority over the delta. Maybe his successors completed work that later memory compressed into one founder's reign. History loves a first king. Archaeology usually finds a process. Still, Narmer remains impossible to ignore. His name appears in royal contexts. His authority appears widespread. His symbols carry the language of kingship in a form that is already startlingly mature. By the time we meet him, Egypt is no longer just a patchwork of competing Nile communities. It is becoming something larger, more centralized, and more dangerous. A state is beginning to speak, and one of the clearest voices it uses is Narmer's. Nowhere is that voice more famous than on a single ceremonial object, carved from dark stone, where a king seems to raise his weapon over a defeated enemy and announce, in image after image, that the two lands belong to one ruler. The object is called the Narmer Palette. It was found at Hieroglyphs in the late 19th century, buried among a deposit of ceremonial objects near the ancient temple of Horus. The place itself mattered. Hierakonpolis had been one of the great power centres of Upper Egypt, long before the First Dynasty. It was a city of temples, workshops, elite graves, and rulers competing for control of the Nile Valley. And somewhere in that sacred landscape, perhaps after it had been used and displayed, Narmer's palette was placed with other offerings. It is made from a dark greenish stone called siltstone, shaped like the cosmetic palettes Egyptians had used for centuries to grind pigments. But this was no ordinary makeup tool. It is too large, too elaborate, too carefully carved. At roughly 2 feet tall, it would have been impractical for daily use. There is a circular area in the centre where pigment could theoretically have been mixed, but that does not mean somebody carried it around to prepare eye paint before breakfast. This was a ceremonial object. It was probably made for a temple, a royal ritual, or a public display of power, a thing designed not simply to be used but to be seen. And what it showed was a king who could do something no local chief was supposed to do. He could rule all of Egypt. On one side, Narmer wears the tall white crown. This crown was associated with Upper Egypt, the long southern Nile Valley, stretching upward from the region around Memphis toward the first cataract. Narmer stands larger than every other human figure around him. That is not because he was unusually tall. Egyptian art is already using scale as a language of power. The king is bigger because the king matters more. He carries a mace in one hand and grips a kneeling captive by the hair with the other. The captive is helpless. Narmer is about to strike. This pose became one of the most enduring images in Egyptian art. For thousands of years, pharaohs would be shown raising a weapon over enemies. On temple walls, statues, reliefs and monuments, the same message returned again and again. The king defeats chaos. The king crushes rebellion. The king protects Egypt by destroying anyone who threatens its order. But on the Narmer Palette, we may be seeing one of the earliest surviving versions of that royal idea. Above the captive is a falcon, Horus, standing on what appears to be a cluster of papyrus plants. Papyrus was strongly connected with Lower Egypt, the northern delta, where marshes and waterways spread toward the Mediterranean. The falcon holds a cord attached to a human head emerging from the plants. It is a strange and compact image, the kind early Egyptian artists loved. A god, a land, and a defeated population compressed into one symbol. The most common interpretation is that Horus is delivering Lower Egypt into Narmer's control. Maybe that is exactly what the scene meant to its first viewers. Narmer, king of Upper Egypt, defeats a northern enemy. Horus himself takes possession of the delta. The god and king act together. The two lands are brought under one authority. But there is a caution here. Ancient royal art almost never gives us a neutral report. It is not journalism carved in stone. It does not show fear, negotiation, compromise, or the long, messy process by which rival communities become part of a kingdom. It shows victory, always victory. A king could lose battles, face rebellions, bargain with rivals, or inherit territories from his predecessors. Yet the official image would still show him standing alone, weapon raised, with the universe apparently cheering him on. So the palette may record a real campaign. It may preserve the memory of a decisive victory in the north. But it may also turn a longer political process into one perfect symbolic moment. Or most likely it does both. Turn the palette over, and Narmer appears again. This time he wears the red crown associated with Lower Egypt. That switch is one of the reasons this object became so famous. On one face he wears the crown of the south. On the other, the crown of the north. The later pharaohs of Egypt would wear a combined crown, usually called the double crown, to represent rule over Upper and Lower Egypt. The Narmer palette does not show that later combined form. Instead, it shows Narmer with each crown separately, almost as if the artist is making the claim in two steps. He is king of the south. He is king of the north. Put those claims together, and you have the king of the two lands. On this side, Narmer walks in procession toward a grim line of defeated enemies. Their bodies lie stretched across the ground, apparently decapitated, their heads placed between their legs. It is not gentle imagery. Early Egyptian state formation was not gentle either. Behind the king come attendants, officials, and men, carrying standards topped with emblems. These standards may represent regional groups, royal institutions, gods, or military units. We cannot identify every symbol with confidence, but their presence tells us something important. Narmer is not alone. He is surrounded by organized power. Standards, attendants, record keepers, ritual specialists, soldiers, perhaps local leaders now bound to the royal court. The image is not just about a strong man winning a fight. It is about an emerging state moving in formation. Below them are two long-necked creatures, their necks twisted together around the circular depression of the palette. They are often called serpopards, a modern word for animals that look part serpent and part leopard. No known animal looks exactly like them. Their handlers pull them into submission, forcing their wild necks into a single controlled circle. Some scholars see this as another image of unification, two powerful but separate forces joined together. Others see creatures of chaos being mastered by royal authority. Those interpretations are not mutually exclusive. In Egyptian thought, bringing separate lands together and defeating chaos could be almost the same act. At the bottom, a bull smashes through a walled enclosure and tramples a fallen enemy. The bull is probably Narmer himself in animal form. That may sound odd, but Egyptian kings were often compared to dangerous animals: bulls, lions, falcons, crocodiles. The king had to be human enough to govern, divine enough to command, and terrifying enough that enemies thought twice before resisting. Here Narmer is not merely defeating a man, he is breaking into a fortified place. He is crushing resistance at its walls. It is conquest reduced to its simplest formula. The king attacks, the enemy falls, the city opens, and yet even here, certainty slips away when we look too closely. Are these scenes all part of one historical campaign? Do they show Narmer conquering the Delta, defeating several rival rulers, and claiming the whole Nile Valley in a single dramatic moment? Possibly, but the palette gives us no date, no battlefield name, no account of what happened before or after. It does not tell us whether the defeated men were Delta rulers, rebels within Upper Egypt, enemies from Nubia, or symbolic stand-ins for every threat the king might face. The labels are too few, the images are powerful, precisely because they can say many things at once. For the people who made it, that may have been the point. Narmer's victory did not need to be limited to one battle. The palette presents him as permanently victorious. He wears both crowns because he is master of both regions. He smites the captive because he always defeats the enemy. Horus takes the papyrus land because the gods themselves authorize his rule. The bull breaks the walls because no rival town can stand against royal force. This is not just the image of a king, it is the blueprint for pharaohship. That is why the Narmer Palette became central to the story of Egyptian unification. It seems to show in one remarkable object the moment when Upper and Lower Egypt became one kingdom. For generations it appeared to offer the answer historians wanted. Here is the conqueror, here are the two crowns, here are the defeated northerners, and here is the birth of dynastic Egypt. But the real answer is more complicated. The palette is evidence that by Narmer's time a ruler could claim authority over both Upper and Lower Egypt. It is evidence that royal artists already understood how to turn violence into political theology. And it is evidence that Egypt's first kings wanted their power to look complete, sacred, and inevitable. Whether that completeness was won in one campaign, assembled through decades of pressure, or inherited from earlier rulers remains harder to know. Still, the palette leaves no doubt about one thing. By around 3100 BCE, somebody calling himself Narmer wanted the world to understand that Egypt had one ruler, one divine protector, and one overwhelming answer to anyone who stood in the way. The king raises his mace, and history, or at least the version carved into stone, kneels beneath it. But a palette is a statement. It tells us what a king wanted, remembered. To find out how Narmer's power may have worked on ordinary days, we have to look at smaller things. Things that would fit in a hand, a scrap of ivory, a lump of dried mud, the neck of a storage jar, a pot marked before it went into a tomb, a storeroom, or onto a boat headed down the Nile. They are less dramatic than a king raising a mace. In some ways they are more revealing, because a kingdom is not held together by victory scenes alone. Somebody has to count the grain. Somebody has to seal the jars. Somebody has to receive goods from distant towns, record where they came from, and make sure they arrive where the king's household needs them. Somebody has to know which storage room contains oil, which contains beer, which contains linen, and which official is responsible if half the delivery vanishes before it reaches the royal court. That is where Narmer begins to appear not only as a conqueror, but as an administrator. His name, written in the early hieroglyphic signs of a catfish and a chisel, has been found on a range of objects from this period. The catfish sign reads Nar, the chisel sign reads Mer. Together, they give us Narmer. Usually the signs appear inside or beside the rectangular royal device called a seric. A seric was not yet the familiar oval cartouche used by later pharaohs. It looked more like the front of a palace. A patterned lower section suggested the royal building itself. Above it perched the falcon god Horus, watching over the king's name. It is a compact idea. The king is a person, but also an institution. His name belongs beneath the god. His authority belongs within the palace. When officials pressed that sign into clay, or scratched it onto a tag, they were not merely identifying one man. They were marking royal control. One of the most important kinds of evidence comes from small ivory labels, often called year labels. These were attached to jars, boxes, or bundles of goods. Many are tiny, some are worn, some preserve only a few signs. But they may have functioned like administrative notes, recording events, deliveries, institutions, or perhaps the particular year in which an item was produced or received. Later Egyptians named years after major events. A year might be remembered as the year of a royal census, the year of a festival, the year a temple was founded, or the year an enemy was defeated. The labels from the dawn of dynasty may represent an early stage in that same habit. Not every label can be read with certainty. Early writing was still developing. The signs can be abbreviated, damaged, or arranged in ways that remain difficult to interpret. But the basic picture is clear enough. The royal household was recording things. That sounds almost boring. It is not boring. It is the beginning of a system capable of turning harvests, livestock, craft goods, and tribute into state power. Imagine a shipment of oil arriving from a delta estate, or jars of wine from a settlement near the Mediterranean coast, or cloth, animal skins, copper, stone vessels, and grain, moving toward a royal centre. Each object has value. Each one can be stored, redistributed, offered at a temple, given to retainers, or sent onward to another region. But only if somebody can track it. Writing does not have to begin with poems or laws. Sometimes it begins because a ruler wants to know where the beer went. Jar inscriptions tell a similar story. On pottery vessels associated with Narmer's time, marks and inscriptions can identify royal ownership, contents, institutions, or places connected to production and delivery. The evidence is fragmentary. A single mark might not always mean what we think it means. Some signs could identify a workshop, a locality, or an official rather than the king himself. But taken together, these marks show a world becoming more organized. Goods were no longer only exchanged face to face between neighboring households. They were moving through wider networks. They were being gathered, stored, and controlled in ways that required shared signs and recognized authority. Then there are sealings. A sealing was made when wet clay was pressed over a knot, a jar stopper, a door fastening, or the lid of a container. A seal was rolled or stamped into the clay. Once it dried, the impression showed that the container or room had been officially closed. Break the seal and everybody knew somebody had opened it. It was ancient security technology, simple but powerful. At sites connected with the earliest dynasty, seal impressions preserve royal names, including Narmers, alongside signs that may refer to institutions, officials, estates, and administrative activities. The seals themselves were often made from small cylinders, rolled across wet clay to produce repeated images. One impression could be a signature. A whole line of impressions could transform a mud stopper into an official document. The king did not need to stand beside every jar. His name could stand there for him. That is one of the strangest and most important changes happening in this period. Royal power was becoming portable. It could travel on a seal, on a label, on the shoulder of a pot. A farmer or trader might never see Narmer in person, but they could encounter the falcon-topped Seric. They could know that these goods belonged to the royal domain, had passed through royal hands, or were being watched by royal officials, and that kind of power reaches farther than an army. It reaches into storehouses, it reaches into workshops, it reaches into the routine movement of food and material. The evidence also points beyond Egypt itself. Vessels and Egyptian-style objects associated with the early dynastic period have been found in parts of southern Canaan and the Levant. At the same time, goods from that eastern Mediterranean world were reaching Egypt. Wine, oils, timber, resins, and other materials could travel through these networks, while Egyptian pottery and perhaps Egyptian officials appeared at settlements far from the Nile. Exactly what this contact looked like is still debated. Were Egyptians establishing trading posts? Were merchants moving goods through local intermediaries? Were some communities under direct Egyptian control? Or were they independent partners drawn into a profitable exchange system? The answer may not be the same in every place, but Narmer's name appearing in this wider landscape matters. It suggests that the new kingship was not confined to a narrow strip of riverbank. It was participating in networks that reached across deserts, coasts, and political boundaries. A ruler who could command imported wine, Levantine oils, cedar timber, copper, and luxury goods had access to resources no village chief could easily control. And resources create followers. Followers create institutions. Institutions create states. This is why the little objects matter so much. Monumental art tells us that Narmer claimed to unite Egypt. Labels, sealings, and jar marks suggest the machinery that could make such a claim real. They show people counting, storing, distributing, sealing, and recording. They show authority becoming repetitive, not one victory. 1,000 small acts of control, a jar sealed at one end of the Nile, a delivery recorded at the other, a royal name pressed into clay, a storehouse door closed under official authority. These are the quiet traces of a kingdom learning how to remember what it owned. And once a state can keep records, move goods, and extend the king's name far beyond the place where he sits, the ruler becomes harder to challenge. Not impossible to challenge, but harder. Narmer's palette gave Egypt the image of a united kingdom. The labels and seals may show us the kingdom beginning to function. But there was one place where the king's name did not travel on a jar, a seal, or a small ivory tag. One place where royal power was gathered around the body itself. Abydos, in Upper Egypt, beside the desert edge west of the Nile, lies a place now called el-Ka'ab. The name means something like the mother of pots, because the ground was once covered with the broken remains of countless ancient vessels. To later Egyptians, Abydos became one of the holiest places in the country. It was associated above all with Osiris, god of the dead and ruler of the underworld. Pilgrims came there for centuries. Kings built temples nearby. Ordinary people left offerings, hoping to be connected to the sacred landscape. But long before Osiris became the great lord of Abydos, this desert cemetery was already important. This was where some of Egypt's earliest kings chose to be buried. And that choice matters. A ruler can govern from a palace. He can send officials to distant towns. He can place his name on seals and labels. But where he is buried tells us something different. It tells us where his followers believed royal authority should endure after death. At el-Ka'ab, the earliest royal tombs are not pyramids. They are not enormous stone monuments visible from miles away. They were built below ground, in the dry desert soil. From above, they may have seemed modest compared with the giant pyramids Egypt would build centuries later. But beneath the surface, they were carefully planned complexes. There were burial chambers lined with mud brick. There were storerooms. There were corridors and subsidiary graves. There were vessels filled with provisions, objects of stone and pottery, seals, labels, and the remains of things meant to accompany the dead ruler into whatever came next. The king was not simply placed in the earth, he was supplied. That is an important distinction. A simple grave says someone died. A royal tomb complex says an institution expected its ruler to continue needing food, goods, attendance, ritual and recognition after death. One of the most important burial complexes at el-Ka'ab is known by the rather unromantic archaeological labels B17 and B18. They are widely associated with Narmer. Not everyone agrees on every detail. The evidence comes from inscriptions, ceilings, fragments, and the position of the tombs within a sequence of early royal burials. Archaeologists do not have a perfectly preserved sign above the entrance saying, "Narmer sleeps here." Ancient tomb robbers were not considerate enough to leave one behind. Still, B17 and B18 have long been linked with Narmer because objects bearing his name were found in the area, and because the complex fits the moment when the separate traditions of Upper and Lower Egypt were beginning to be drawn into one royal system. The tomb consists of two adjoining mud brick chambers. That may sound small for a king who later tradition remembered as the founder of Egypt. But this was the beginning. Egyptian royal architecture had not yet become a competition in making the largest possible mountain of stone. The early dynasty was still inventing the language of kingship. It was working out how a ruler should live, how he should be represented, how his goods should be managed, and how his death should be transformed into something permanent. Even these chambers required labour, planning, and resources. Mud brick had to be made. Timber and mats may have been used in roofing and fittings. Goods had to be assembled. Vessels had to be filled and carried into the desert. Officials, workers, craft specialists, and members of the royal household all had roles to play. And the tomb was not alone. Around the earliest royal graves at Abydos were additional burials, sometimes called subsidiary graves. Many appear to have belonged to people connected with the royal court, attendants, officials, retainers, perhaps servants whose identities are now lost. This is one of the darker parts of early Egyptian kingship. At several First Dynasty tombs, the surrounding graves seem to have been made at roughly the same time as the king's burial. That has led many scholars to argue that some attendants may have been sacrificed or compelled to die when the ruler died, so that they could continue serving him beyond the grave. For Narmer's own complex, the evidence is less straightforward than it is for some later First Dynasty kings. The cemetery has been disturbed, excavated over many decades, and robbed repeatedly in antiquity. It is not always possible to say exactly which graves belonged to which ruler, or whether every nearby burial was part of one original funerary event. But the broader pattern is hard to ignore. Early kings were buried not merely with objects, but within communities of death. That suggests an authority reaching into the lives of other people with extraordinary force. The king's household was not just a group of employees who went home when the workday ended. It may have been imagined as an extension of the king himself, bound to him in life and perhaps beyond it. Think about what that means. The royal state was still young. Its writing system was still experimental. Its borders were still being negotiated. Yet the king could command labour for a burial complex, collect goods from across the Nile Valley, and organise ceremonies that marked his death as an event affecting an entire court. A tomb like B17, B18 was therefore more than a grave. It was a statement about order. The ruler had controlled resources in life. In death, those resources were gathered around him. Food, drink, pottery, stone vessels, luxury materials, and perhaps human attendants were placed within the royal landscape. The king remained the centre. Even dead, he was not imagined as ordinary. And perhaps that was the point. A new kingdom needs people to believe that royal power does not disappear when one king dies. If authority ends at the grave, every succession becomes a dangerous opening. Rivals can claim the throne, regional leaders can break away. Old alliances can collapse. But if the dead king remains powerful, honoured, and ritually sustained, then his successor can present himself not as a completely new ruler, but as the next holder of an authority that never truly stopped. The cemetery helped make dynasty possible. Still, we have to be careful. El Ka'ab has suffered almost every kind of damage an ancient site can suffer. Tombs were robbed in antiquity, sometimes soon after burial. Later Egyptians revisited the area for their own religious purposes. Wind, sand, moisture, insects, and time destroyed organic materials. Early excavators worked before modern archaeological methods were fully developed, and some records are incomplete by modern standards. Objects were moved, contexts were disturbed, fragments were separated from the places where they had originally been deposited. So when we say B17 and B18 were Narmer's tomb, we are making a strong and widely accepted association, but not an unbreakable certainty. That uncertainty is frustrating. It is also honest. The first kings of Egypt did not leave us neat archives explaining every decision. They left broken jars, mud brick walls, disturbed graves, seal impressions, and names surviving in fragments. We reconstruct their world from what robbers missed, what sand preserved, and what later generations did not completely erase. And yet, even through all that damage, Abydos still speaks. It tells us that Narmer, or a king very close to Narmer's moment, was not simply a figure on a ceremonial palette. He belonged to a royal tradition rooted in Upper Egypt. He was buried among predecessors and successors in a desert cemetery that would remain sacred for thousands of years. The king's name could be pressed into clay, his body could be placed beneath the desert. And around both, a new state was learning how to make power survive. But Abydos was not the whole world. Follow the Nile south from the royal cemetery, past the last cultivated fields of Upper Egypt, and the river enters a different landscape. The valley narrows, desert cliffs come closer, the Nile begins to run through cataracts, stretches of granite and turbulent water that make travel difficult, but not impossible. This was Lower Nubia, the region between southern Egypt and what is now northern Sudan. To the early Egyptians, it was not some empty land beyond the edge of civilization. It was a neighbouring world, a place of trade, movement, conflict, and ideas moving in both directions along the river. And if we want to understand how Egyptian kingship emerged, Nubia matters, because some of the most surprising evidence from this period was found not at Abydos, not at Hieroglyphs, and not in the Delta. It was found at Qustul. Qustul was an ancient cemetery in Lower Nubia, close to the Nile and close to the routes that connected Egypt with Inner Africa. In the late 4th millennium BC, the people buried there belonged largely to what archaeologists call the A-group culture. That label sounds technical because it is technical. Archaeologists use it for a distinctive Nubian population known through its graves, pottery, ornaments and settlement traces. But behind the label were real communities. Farmers, herders, traders, craftspeople, elites, families, and perhaps rulers whose names were never written down in a form we can read. Their graves could be richly furnished. There were fine ceramics. There were stone vessels. There were objects made from materials that had travelled long distances. And there were Egyptian goods too, especially in elite burials. For a long time that led to a simple story. Egypt was rising. Nubia was receiving Egyptian imports. End of discussion. But ancient history is almost never that simple. In 1964, excavators working at Qustul found a small carved incense burner in a grave known as L24. It was made of stone, damaged, and not very large. Yet its images caused an argument that has lasted for decades. On its surface appeared a royal-looking scene. There was a boat. There were standards. The emblems carried before rulers and gods. There were captive figures, and there was a person who seems to wear a tall white crown, the kind later associated with the kings of Upper Egypt. Above or near the scene was a falcon-like image, another symbol deeply connected with Egyptian royal power. For anyone who had studied the Narmer Palette, the imagery felt familiar. A king, a crown, a ritual journey by boat, enemies subdued, divine or royal symbols raised high above the scene. It looked at first glance like the visual language of pharaohs. But the incense burner came from Nubia, and that created a problem. In the 1970s, archaeologist Bruce Williams made a bold argument. He suggested that the Qustul imagery showed a powerful Nubian kingdom, perhaps one that had developed royal symbolism before Egypt's First Dynasty. In this view, Egyptian kingship may not have appeared in isolation in the Nile Valley. Some of its key ideas might have been shaped, influenced, or even anticipated farther south. It was an exciting possibility. Maybe the earliest kings of Egypt were not simply inventing royal power from scratch. Maybe they were part of a larger political world in which Nubian elites also used crowns, ceremonial boats, standards, and scenes of conquest to show authority. But other scholars were not convinced. They pointed out that the Qustul incense burner is hard to date with perfect precision. Its images are not a complete written statement. They are tiny, worn, and open to interpretation. The objects in the cemetery included many Egyptian imports, and some researchers argued that the burner itself may have been made in Egypt, or made by artists working in an Egyptian-inspired style. Perhaps it showed an Egyptian ruler. Perhaps it was a prestige object carried south through trade. Perhaps Nubian elites adopted Egyptian royal imagery because that imagery was already becoming powerful and prestigious. Or perhaps both regions were drawing from a shared Nile Valley tradition, one older and broader than the later border between Egypt and Nubia. That last possibility is worth sitting with. We often imagine Egypt as a sealed civilization, neatly contained between the Mediterranean and the First Cataract. The ancient Nile did not work that way. The river was a highway. Boats carried grain, pottery, stone, timber, and people. They carried stories. They carried marriage alliances. They carried craftsmen who had seen how another court made its vessels, buried its dead, or displayed its ruler. They also carried materials that Egypt wanted badly: gold from Nubian regions, ivory from farther south, ebony and other valuable woods, animal skins, cattle, incense materials, stone and exotic goods that made royal households look richer, stranger, and more connected to distant places. A king who could control these flows was not merely wealthy. He was becoming necessary. He could reward followers with rare objects. He could equip temples and tombs. He could make access to prestige depend on proximity to the royal court. Trade was not separate from state formation. Trade helped give the early states something to organize, tax, protect, and fight over. And yes, there was fighting. By the time of Egypt's earliest dynasties, evidence suggests that Egyptian rulers were exerting increasing pressure into Lower Nubia. The archaeological record shows strong Egyptian contact, Egyptian-style goods, and eventually a dramatic decline in the A-group culture after the beginning of the First Dynasty. Why that happened remains debated. Military campaigns may have played a role. So may shifting trade routes, political disruption, environmental pressures, and the growing ability of Egypt's new state to dominate the narrow corridor of the Nile. Later Egyptian kings would make their ambitions unmistakable. They would send armies south, seize gold-bearing regions, build fortresses, and describe Nubia as a land to be controlled. But in Narmer's time, the story was still forming. Lower Nubia was not simply Egypt's victim, and it was not necessarily Egypt's teacher. It was a neighbouring centre of power, tied into the same river system, participating in the same struggle to turn wealth, violence, ritual, and long-distance connections into authority. The Qustul incense burner does not give us a final answer. It gives us something more useful, a warning. When we look at the first Egyptian kings, we should not imagine a lone genius rising from the desert and creating monarchy all by himself. Narmer emerged from a crowded world. Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt, Nubia, the eastern deserts, the Levant, and trade networks reaching still farther away were all part of the larger system. The First Dynasty was Egyptian, but the world that made it possible was much wider than Egypt. And that wider world had been producing rulers before Narmer ever lifted a mace or wore a crown. This is one of the strangest things about the beginning of Egypt. Narmer is famous because his name survives in dramatic places. On palettes, on ceilings, on labels, in tombs, that archaeologists can identify with reasonable confidence. But when we look just a little earlier, the record does not go blank. It becomes ghostly. There are other royal names. There are falcons. There are palace-shaped frames called serics. There are ink marks on jars, scratched signs on pottery, seal impressions, and fragments of bone or ivory labels. The evidence is small, often broken, sometimes found far from the places where it was originally made. But together it suggests that Narmer belonged to a line of rulers already learning how to command people, goods, symbols, and memory. These were the kings before the king, or, more carefully, the rulers who seem to have been building the kind of authority that later Egyptian kingship would inherit. One of the clearest is a ruler modern scholars call Ka. His name is usually written inside a seric, the rectangular image of a palace facade that became one of the basic signs of royal identity. Above the seric, in later periods, a falcon often stands watch. The falcon represented Horus, the god with whom Egyptian kings increasingly identified themselves. The message was powerful even before it became standardized. This person is not merely a wealthy local leader. This person belongs to the palace. This person rules under divine protection. Or perhaps this person is already claiming to embody a divine order on earth. Ka's name has been found at Abydos in the royal cemetery landscape, where later First Dynasty kings would build their tombs. It has also appeared at sites such as Tarkhan in Lower Egypt, hundreds of miles north. That matters. A name moving across that distance may not prove that Ka controlled every village between Abydos and the delta. Ancient political power was rarely so neat, but it does show connections. Goods were moving. Administrators, traders, or royal agents were moving. And the ruler's name was being attached to containers and supplies as they travelled. Think about what that requires. Someone has to produce the jars. Someone has to fill them with wine, oil, grain, or other goods. Someone has to mark them. Someone has to know that the mark means something. And someone, somewhere else, has to accept that the mark carries authority. That is not yet the bureaucracy of the Old Kingdom, with its armies of scribes and mountains of tax records. But it is the beginning of a system. A ruler's identity is becoming portable. It can travel on a jar. It can survive after the ruler is dead. It can tell people that this object, this delivery, this place, belongs within a larger political network. Ka was not alone. Another shadowy ruler is known as Hor, whose name appears in inscriptions that may be earlier than Ka's. And then there are the rulers conventionally called Scorpion, plural, because this is where the story gets complicated. The name Scorpion sounds wonderfully simple. It sounds like the name of one fierce king stalking through the Nile Valley with a tail raised behind him. But the evidence may point to more than one ruler, separated in time, or perhaps to names and symbols that we do not fully understand. One figure, often called Scorpion I, is associated by many scholars with Tomb Uj at Abydos. This tomb was discovered in Cemetery U, a burial ground older than the royal tombs of the First Dynasty. It contained hundreds of imported jars, including vessels from the southern Levant, along with small tags marked with some of the earliest known Egyptian writing. Not long speeches, not royal biographies, just signs. Place names, goods, counts, administrative information. But that is exactly why they are important. Writing does not begin because people suddenly feel poetic. It often begins because someone needs to manage things, to track deliveries, to identify origins, to remember obligations when memory alone is no longer enough. If Tomb Uj did belong to a ruler called Scorpion, then his court was already gathering foreign goods, organising storage, and using written marks to keep control of a growing economy. That is a major step toward the Egyptian state. But even here, caution is necessary. The identification of Tomb Uj with Scorpion I is widely discussed, not universally settled. The scorpion sign appears in the tomb complex, but linking every symbol to one named individual is difficult when the evidence is more than 5,000 years old and often incomplete. Then there is Scorpion Throw, the ruler associated with the famous scorpion macehead from Hieroglyphs. On it, a king wearing the white crown appears in a ceremonial scene, apparently digging with a hoe. Around him are standards, attendants, and symbols of organized power. It may show irrigation, it may show the founding or opening of land. It may be a ritual connected to kingship rather than an ordinary farming task. Whatever the exact event, the image makes one thing clear. This ruler did not present himself as a village chief. He presented himself as the person who made order happen, the person who opened fields, the person who commanded symbols, labour, ceremony, and perhaps the river itself. And somewhere in the middle of all these broken names and ancient arguments, a small reminder. If you enjoy mysteries where the evidence is real, but the answers remain uncertain, the channel's book about the 12 unexplained mysteries is available on the website. The link is in the description. Modern archaeologists often group rulers like Hor, Ka, and the Scorpions under the label Dynasty 0. It is a useful label, and also a misleading one. Useful because it reminds us that royal institutions existed before the First Dynasty. Misleading because these rulers probably did not belong to one clean, numbered dynasty with a fixed succession, like the lists written by later Egyptian historians. Dynasty 0 is a modern filing cabinet. It gathers together late pre-dynastic rulers from roughly the period before Narmer, especially those associated with Upper Egypt and the final stages of unification. But the people living then did not call themselves Dynasty 0. They may not have agreed on who ruled all Egypt. Some rulers may have controlled only parts of the valley. Some may have been rivals. Some may have been ancestors, allies, or enemies of Narmer's own house. and some names may represent titles, local authorities, or traditions that we can no longer reconstruct. This is why Narmer should not be imagined as a man appearing from nowhere, holding a palette in one hand and a finished kingdom in the other. He was the product of a long experiment. For generations, rulers had been testing the tools of power: palace imagery, sacred falcons, ceremonial violence, long-distance trade, tombs filled with wealth, marked containers, early writing, the ability to make a name mean something beyond the place where its owner stood. Narmer may have pushed that process farther than anyone before him. He may have inherited a kingdom nearly made, or he may have defeated rivals who had been building similar systems of their own. Either way, the First Dynasty did not begin in empty darkness. It rose out of a shadow dynasty of forgotten rulers, each leaving behind just enough evidence to tell us that Egypt's first king was not the beginning of the story. He was the moment when an older story finally became impossible to ignore. So how did that older story become a kingdom? The traditional answer is wonderfully simple. A king from Upper Egypt marched north. He defeated Lower Egypt. He put on the double crown, and in a single decisive moment, the long Nile Valley became one country. It is a perfect founding story, clear, violent, memorable, and it may contain some truth. But real history is usually less like a door being kicked open, and more like a river changing course. Slowly at first, then all at once it seems, the water is somewhere new. The Narmer Palette is one reason the Conquest story became so powerful. On one side, Narmer wears the tall white crown of Upper Egypt. He grips a captive by the hair and raises a mace to strike. Above the captive are signs that may refer to the Delta, the northern land. On the other side, Narmer wears the red crown associated with Lower Egypt. The message seems obvious. South conquers north, except images of kings hitting enemies are not necessarily battlefield reports. Egyptian rulers would repeat that pose for more than 3,000 years. Pharaoh after pharaoh appears with one arm lifted, enemy kneeling, divine order about to crush chaos. Sometimes these images may commemorate real fighting. Sometimes they are ritual, sometimes they are propaganda in the deepest ancient sense of the word, not simply a lie, but a public declaration of how the world is supposed to work. The king wins, Egypt is ordered, enemies are defeated. That does not mean Narmer never fought. Late pre-dynastic Egypt shows signs that violence mattered. Fortified settlements existed in some regions. Burials sometimes contain weapons. Rival elite centres competed for access to land, labour, trade routes, and the valuable flow of goods along the Nile. A mace head, a knife handle, or a carved palette could preserve scenes of captives, raids, and defeated enemies, because such things were familiar enough to have meaning. But familiar is not the same as proven. We do not possess a written dispatch saying, "In the 3rd year of Narmer, the army crossed into the Delta and conquered every northern town." What we have is much more frustrating. And much more interesting. We have traces of contact. Upper Egyptian pottery styles appear in northern sites. Southern-style tombs and prestige goods become increasingly visible in the Delta. Names associated with Upper Egyptian rulers turn up on jars, ceilings and labels far from Abydos. At the same time, Lower Egypt was not an empty prize waiting to be collected. The Delta had its own communities, its own trade connections, especially with the southern Levant, and its own local elites. This may have been a meeting of expanding systems, not simply one primitive region swallowing another. Trade could have helped make unification possible. Imagine the Nile as the longest road in the country. Boats move grain, stone, pottery, wine, oil, timber, animal products and luxury goods between communities that may never meet face to face. Every journey creates relationships. Every delivery requires trust, bargaining, protection, and record-keeping. A ruler who can secure river traffic, organize storehouses, and reward allies is already becoming more than a local chief. And after enough generations, economic connections can begin to look like political connections. A northern town may accept southern goods before it accepts a southern king. A local leader may adopt southern symbols before becoming a royal official. An elite family may marry into another elite family, exchange gifts, send children to another court, or recognize a stronger ruler because resistance has become too expensive. Marriage is difficult to prove in this distant period. Human relationships almost never survive in the archaeological record with neat labels attached. But royal marriage, hostage exchange, and alliance building were common tools of state formation in many ancient societies. There is no reason to assume early Egypt was somehow different. A kingdom can be built with spears. It can also be built with gifts, kinship, and carefully arranged obligations. And perhaps with imitation. This is one of the quietest clues. Before Egypt was fully united, rulers in different regions were already using similar visual language. Palace facades, animal symbols, decorated ceremonial objects, elite burial customs. The idea that authority belonged to someone who stood above ordinary communities and connected human order to divine order. Symbols can travel faster than armies. A ruler may claim the red crown of the north before he commands every northern field, village, and canal. He may place his name on goods moving through a region before local people think of themselves as subjects in the later Egyptian sense. He may be recognized at one trading post, ignored at another, and opposed farther downstream. Political control is not a light switch. It has degrees. One region may pay tribute, another may supply goods through alliance. Another may be occupied by officials. Another may remain technically independent while copying the king's style because it is useful, prestigious, or frightening. This is why many Egyptologists now see unification less as one event than as a process that may have unfolded unevenly over generations, beginning with rulers before Narmer and continuing after him. Upper Egyptian kings extended their networks northward. Northern elites negotiated, resisted, adapted, or disappeared into the new order. Some conflicts may have been brutal, some alliances may have been voluntary. Most were probably neither completely voluntary nor completely forced. That is how states often grow, not through one clean victory, through pressure, opportunity, fear, marriage, trade, administration, ritual, and time. Then, after the process is finished or finished enough, later generations look backward and choose a single founder. They want a name, they want a first king, they want the moment when chaos ended and Egypt began. Narmer became one candidate for that role because the archaeological record remembers him so vividly. But later Egyptians preserved another name, Menes. And the question of whether those two names belonged to the same man would become one of the great identity puzzles at the beginning of Egyptian history. So, who was Menes? Was he Narmer, the king whose name appears on palettes, jars, ceilings, and labels at the very moment Egypt seems to be becoming one kingdom? Or was Menes Narmer's successor, the ruler we call Hor-Aha? Or, more unsettlingly, was Menes not a name in the modern sense at all, but a title, a memory, or a later attempt to compress a complicated political process into one human life? The problem begins with the names themselves. Narmer is a name we can see. It appears inside a seric, the rectangular palace facade frame used for early royal names. Above it stands the falcon god Horus. The signs are usually read as Nar, a catfish, and Mer, a chisel. Catfish chisel. Narmer. It sounds strange to us because ancient royal names were not designed for our convenience. They were images, sacred claims, wordplay, and political statements all at once. Menes comes from a very different kind of evidence. The name survives in much later Egyptian king lists and in Greek accounts written thousands of years after the First Dynasty. The Egyptian form is usually read as Mene, while the Greek historian Manetho called him Menes. Later tradition remembered Menes as the first king of a united Egypt, the man who brought the two lands together, the man associated with Memphis, the beginning. But the closer we get to the actual beginning, the harder he is to find. No object from Narmer's lifetime says, in a clear ancient voice, Narmer, also called Menes. No tomb inscription settles the matter. No surviving royal document gives us the kind of neat identification historians dream about. Instead, we have fragments, and the fragments can be fitted together in more than one way. The most common solution is that Menes and Narmer were the same person. This argument starts with timing. Narmer is the earliest ruler whose name appears widely across Egypt, from Upper Egyptian royal centres to sites in the Delta and beyond. His imagery connects him strongly to the idea of the two lands. Later Egyptians remembered a first unifier. Narmer is the best archaeological candidate for that memory. Then there are seal impressions from Abydos, found in the royal cemetery landscape where the first kings were buried. These impressions preserve sequences of royal names. Narmer appears at the beginning of the line, followed by Hor-Aha and later First Dynasty rulers. That does not prove Narmer was Menes, but it does show that Egyptians close to the events treated Narmer as the first figure in a royal sequence that later tradition would turn into the beginning of dynastic history. There is also a small but heavily debated sign, MN. In Egyptian, MN can carry the sense of enduring, remaining, or being established. Some scholars have seen this as a possible connection to Menes, whose name may mean something like the one who endures. On certain early sealings and labels, signs connected with MN appear near royal names. For a long time this seemed like a promising bridge between Narmer and the later founder called Menes. But promising is not the same as certain. The sign MN is also an ordinary Egyptian word. It can be part of a phrase, it can be an epithet. It can mean that something, perhaps the king's institution or royal power, endures. A tiny sign on a damaged ceiling is not a modern identity card. And then there is Hor-Aha. Hor-Aha means fighting Horus. He followed Narmer in the early royal sequence, and his reign may have helped turn a fragile union into a functioning state. Some scholars have argued that Hor-Aha, not Narmer, is the best candidate for Menes. Why? Because later tradition may have remembered the ruler who consolidated the kingdom rather than the ruler who began the process. Narmer may have been the great late predynastic king, the man who projected authority across the Nile Valley. Hor-Aha may have been the ruler who inherited that achievement, expanded it, organized it, and became, in retrospect, the first true dynastic king. There are also possible name connections. Early kings did not use names in the simple way later rulers did. Narmer and Hor-Aha are Horus names, names connected to the falcon god and written in the Serach. But a king could also possess other names, titles, epithets and identities used in different settings. Later pharaohs had long royal titulary systems. They could be known by a Horus name, a two ladies' name, a golden Horus name, a throne name, and a birth name. The First Dynasty system was still developing, but the basic problem already existed. One king could be remembered under one name in a temple list, another in a tomb, another on a seal, and another in a story told 1,000 years later. So the fact that Narmer does not look like Menes on the page does not mean they could not be the same man. But neither does it prove that they were. The name Menes may preserve Narmer's personal name. It may preserve a name or title associated with Hor-Aha. It may even preserve a blurred memory of both rulers, with Narmer as the conqueror and Aha as the consolidator, fused by later tradition into one perfect founder. History does this all the time. Real change happens through many hands over many years. Then memory chooses one face for the statue. The most defensible answer is not a dramatic final reveal. It is a careful uncertainty. Narmer remains the strongest archaeological candidate for Menes. Hor-Aha remains a serious alternative, and Menes himself may be less a missing man than a name created at the point where evidence becomes memory, which means the first king of Egypt may not have been erased completely. He may have been divided into pieces, scattered across ceilings, king lists, ceremonial objects and stories, waiting for us to decide which pieces belong together. And that is where Hor-Aha becomes more than just the name after Narmer on a list. He becomes a test case for how unstable the beginning of a dynasty can be. Hor-Aha, usually translated as Fighting Horus, was one of the earliest kings of the First Dynasty. In the royal sequence preserved by seal impressions from Abydos, he comes immediately after Narmer, not centuries later, not after some lost age of confusion. Right after him, which sounds simple, a king dies. His successor takes the throne. The dynasty continues. But early Egypt was not yet the huge, ancient, almost mechanical civilization we tend to imagine. There were no pyramids, no vast stone temples filled with neatly carved king lists, no bureaucracy with 2,000 years of practice behind it. The state was still new enough that each royal death may have been a dangerous moment. Authority had to pass from one person to another, from one court to another, from one set of allies to another, without the whole thing coming apart. And Hor-Aha seems to have inherited something substantial. His tomb lies at el-Kab, the royal cemetery at Abydos, in the same desert landscape that holds the burials of Narmer and the later First Dynasty kings. This was not an accidental place. Abydos was becoming a royal ancestral ground, a place where the earliest rulers were buried, remembered and linked to the sacred landscape of Upper Egypt. Narmer's tomb is generally identified with two connected chambers, known to archaeologists as B17 and B18. Hor-Aha's burial complex nearby is larger and more elaborate. It includes several large mud brick chambers, usually identified as B10, B15 and B19, arranged as a connected royal complex. The layout matters. These were not grand stone monuments visible from miles away. They were underground or low mud brick structures, built in a world where royal power was still expressed through timber, brick, painted surfaces, precious goods, and human labour rather than gigantic carved blocks. Most of the original contents were looted long ago. The roofs collapsed, the mud bricks softened and eroded. But the footprint remains, and Hor-Aha's footprint is impressive. His burial was not simply a bigger hole in the ground. It appears to have been a planned complex with storage areas and subsidiary graves around it. Archaeologists have identified dozens of smaller burials associated with his tomb. Many seem to have been for court officials, servants, or retainers who were buried at the same time as the king. This is one of the darker facts at the beginning of Egyptian kingship. Some of these people may have died naturally and been buried near their ruler, but the pattern strongly suggests that at least many were sacrificed when Hor-Aha died, sent into death to serve him there, just as they had served him in life. Imagine what that tells us about the new monarchy. The king was no longer just the strongest man in one town. His death could draw dozens of other deaths with it. His court, his household, and his authority extended beyond his own body. Even in the grave, the ruler was surrounded by a miniature version of the state. That does not mean Hor-Aha invented the practice. There are earlier signs of elite retainer burial, and the custom continued under some later First Dynasty kings, but his tomb shows the institution becoming strikingly organized. Royal power was acquiring scale. It was learning how to make itself permanent, or at least how to look permanent. The objects linked to Hor-Aha tell a similar story of continuity. His name appears in the same basic royal form used by Narmer, a seric, the palace facade enclosure topped by the falcon of Horus. The king's name was not just written, it was placed inside an image of the royal palace, under the protection of a god. That visual language carried a message. The ruler was Horus on earth. The palace was the centre of order. The kingdom continued because the divine office continued. And this is important. Hor-Aha does not look like the leader of a completely new regime replacing Narmer's. He looks like the next ruler in a developing system. Ceilings, labels, pottery inscriptions, and royal burials show administrative habits continuing across the transition. Goods were collected, counted, stored, sealed, and moved. Royal names travelled on containers. Officials operated within a court connected to distant places. Ritual imagery still linked kingship with Horus, with Upper and Lower Egypt, and with the maintenance of order. The state Narmer helped project did not vanish when Narmer disappeared from the record. It kept going under Aha, which brings us back to Menes. If later Egyptians remembered the first king as the founder of a united Egypt, which moment were they remembering? The first dramatic claim to victory, the first ruler to dominate key regions, the first king to establish a stable succession, the first monarch whose administration reached far enough that later generations could still feel its effects. Narmer may fit the first image. He is the king of the palette, the catfish and chisel name connected to conquest, ceremony, and the two lands. Hor-Aha may fit another image. He is the ruler who seems to stand at the beginning of a durable royal line, buried in a larger complex, surrounded by a court, governing through systems that outlived one reign. For that reason, some scholars have proposed that Hor-Aha was the historical figure later remembered as Menes. The argument is not proof. There is still no inscription saying Hor-Aha, whose other name was Menes, but it explains something that often happens in human memory. The person who starts a change is not always the person remembered as its founder. Sometimes the founder is the one who makes the change stick. And succession makes this even more complicated. Early royal identities were layered. A king could be known by a Horus name, perhaps by another personal name, by titles, by ritual epithets, and by names used in different administrative settings. Later scribes, working centuries or millennia afterward, may have encountered traditions that did not preserve these names in the same way. One source remembered Narmer, another remembered Aha. Another remembered a founder called Meni, the enduring one. And over time, the boundaries between them may have softened. Picture two rulers standing at the threshold of Egyptian history. One brings together the political forces that make a kingdom possible. The next inherits that fragile achievement and turns it into routine. Later generations look backward across thousands of years and ask a question that the evidence cannot cleanly answer. Which one was first? The answer may be that both were. Not the same person necessarily, not interchangeable, but two rulers so close to the beginning, so deeply connected by succession, administration, and royal memory, that history eventually began treating them as parts of one founding story. And that story was about to become much larger than either man. Much larger because a kingdom is not held together by a king's name alone. A king can win a battle. He can marry into a powerful family. He can place his symbol on a ceremonial palette and declare that Upper and Lower Egypt are one. But making that claim real year after year was a different kind of conquest. It meant knowing where the grain was. It meant knowing who owed labour. It meant knowing which jars of oil belonged to the palace, which cattle belonged to a royal estate, which shipments of stone had arrived from the desert, and which official had opened a storehouse without permission. That is where the First Dynasty begins to look less like a legend about one heroic founder, and more like the beginning of a state. Not a modern state, not an empire with ministries, tax forms and armies in matching uniforms. Early Egypt was still a patchwork of villages, river towns, farming communities, desert routes, shrines, estates and regional elites. Most people probably lived close to the rhythms that had governed the Nile Valley for thousands of years. Planting, harvesting, fishing, herding, making pottery, raising children, burying the dead, but above those local rhythms a new system was spreading. The royal court was learning how to gather goods from many places, move them over long distances, store them, protect them, and redistribute them. And the evidence for that system often comes in objects so small you could lose them in your hand. Clay ceilings. A ceiling began as a lump of wet clay pressed over a jar stopper, a tied bundle, a door fastening, or the lid of a container. Then someone stamped it with a seal. Once the clay dried, the container could not be opened without breaking the seal. Simple, but also revolutionary. A broken ceiling could tell an official that somebody had opened a storehouse. A seal impression could identify the royal household, an institution, a particular estate, or perhaps the person responsible for a shipment. The object itself might be gone after 5,000 years. The grain eaten, the oil poured out, the cloth rotted away. But the little lump of clay survives, carrying the mark of the system that controlled it. At Abydos, especially in the tombs and surrounding deposits linked to the early kings, archaeologists have found seal impressions naming rulers and recording administrative activity. These are not just royal signatures, they are traces of movement. Goods entering a royal domain, goods leaving it, officials handling them, institutions operating under the king's authority. And then there are the labels, early ivory and bone tags, often attached to jars or other goods, can carry tiny inscriptions. A royal name, a place name, an event, a count. Sometimes the meaning is frustratingly unclear, because the writing system was still young and the texts are brief. But the overall pattern is hard to miss. People were beginning to record things because remembering them was no longer enough. Imagine a palace receiving deliveries from dozens of communities, grain from one district, wine from another, oil, linen, wood, animal products, stone vessels, copper incense, perhaps luxury goods brought through trade routes reaching far beyond the Nile Valley. A ruler could not personally inspect every jar. Even the king's closest household could not keep all of that in their heads. So information had to become portable. A seal could travel with a container. A label could travel with a shipment. A mark could connect an object to an estate, a workshop, a storehouse, or a royal official. Writing at this stage was not mainly poetry or philosophy. It was power made practical. It allowed the palace to reach into places where the king himself was nowhere near. This is also why royal estates matter so much. The early Egyptian state was not simply collecting taxes from an already organized nation. In many cases it seems to have built or claimed productive domains of its own. Estates connected to the crown could produce grain, livestock, wine, textiles, and other resources. Their names appear on ceilings and labels, suggesting that they were recognized units within a growing economic network. Some may have been directly managed by royal agents. Others may have operated through local leaders whose status now depended on cooperation with the court. The details are debated. The evidence is incomplete. But the direction is clear. The palace was becoming an economic centre. Not because it produced everything itself, but because it could pull goods together from many different communities and send them out again where they were needed. To feed workers, to support officials, to supply ceremonies, to equip expeditions, to reward allies, to build tombs, shrines, enclosures, and royal compounds. And food was the foundation of all of it. Grain is not glamorous. It does not shine like gold or lapis lazuli. It does not carry the mystery of incense from distant lands. But grain feeds labourers. Grain supports specialists who are not farming full-time. Grain lets a court keep craftsmen, boat crews, guards, messengers, and administrators working through the year. If you can gather surplus grain and store it safely, you can do something remarkable. You can turn a seasonal harvest into permanent political power. The same was true of labour. Early kings did not necessarily command a standing workforce in the modern sense, but they could draw people together for particular tasks. Digging, building, transporting, harvesting royal fields, quarrying stone, sailing goods along the Nile, serving in ceremonies. The royal tombs at Abydos, with their mud-brick chambers, subsidiary burials, storerooms, and carefully organised construction, were possible only because someone could mobilise large numbers of people and resources. That required more than fear. It required officials. We rarely know these people as fully as we know later Egyptian administrators. Their titles are often uncertain, their names fragmentary, their lives almost invisible. But they were there. People who managed goods, supervised work, maintained seals, handled records, and connected the ruler's household to the wider country. They were the human machinery of the new state, and temples were part of that machinery too, though not in the simple sense of being controlled offices of the palace. Local cult centres had their own traditions, their own sacred places, and their own communities. But royal power and temple institutions were becoming deeply connected. Kings offered goods to gods. Temples received resources. Sacred symbols helped legitimize political authority. In return, the language of the divine made the king's expanding reach seem natural, even necessary. The king was not merely taking grain from villages. He was maintaining order between humans, gods, land, river, and sky. That idea would become central to Egyptian civilization. Later Egyptians called it mat, right order, balance, truth, the proper arrangement of the world. In the First Dynasty, the full concept was still taking shape. But the foundations were already visible: a sealed storeroom, a labelled jar, an estate bearing a royal name, a shipment arriving from Nubia or the Eastern Desert, a temple receiving offerings, a local community tied, little by little, to the palace. This was how the claim over the two lands became more than ceremony. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt were not united simply because an artist showed one king wearing two crowns. They became increasingly connected because goods, people, obligations, and information moved through a royal network. The king's reach was measured in ceilings, in storehouses, in the hands that tied a jar shut, pressed wet clay over its stopper, and stamped into it the proof that somewhere, far away, the palace was watching. And once the palace was watching, it needed a way to make its gaze travel. A clay ceiling could carry a mark, an ivory tag could identify a shipment. But over time, those marks became more than simple symbols. They became writing, not writing as we usually imagine it, not long histories, not poems, letters, laws, or detailed accounts of ordinary life. The earliest Egyptian writing was brief, practical, and intensely focused on what the royal court needed to know. A name, a place, a quantity, an institution, a delivery. an event important enough to be tied to a particular year. The first signs appear in late pre-dynastic Egypt, around the 4th millennium BCE, as communities along the Nile were becoming more connected, more unequal and more politically competitive. Archaeologists have found small tags of ivory, bone, wood and clay from places like Abydos that carry incised signs. Some seem to identify goods. Others may refer to estates, workshops, places of origin or officials. A few combine pictures and signs in ways that are still difficult to read with confidence. But the broad pattern is clear. Things were being marked because they had to be tracked. Imagine a jar arriving at a royal storehouse. It might hold wine from the delta, oil, grain, fat, linen, or some valuable imported product. The jar itself tells you almost nothing once it is stacked among hundreds of others. But attach a little tag to its neck, scratch in the name of an estate, perhaps add a number or a place sign, and suddenly the container has a memory. It can tell an official where it came from, who was responsible for it, where it was supposed to go. Writing made information survive the journey, and that matters because early kings were trying to rule something larger than a single town. Their authority had to extend beyond the place where they stood. A king could not sail to every village, inspect every harvest, or personally witness every exchange. But his name could appear on a label, his seal could close a jar, his emblem could be impressed into clay. The king became present through marks. This is one reason the royal name is so important in early Egypt. A name was not just a convenient way of identifying a person. It was an instrument of rule, repeated on ceilings, labels, vessels, and offerings. The name connected distant actions to one central source of authority. And Egyptian kings did not write their names in an ordinary box. They used the seric. A seric was a rectangular frame representing the facade of a palace. At its base, it looks like the patterned wall of a royal building. Above it sits a falcon, the god Horus. Inside the frame appears the king's name. It is a remarkably dense political statement. The palace is there. The ruler is there. And above the ruler, or perhaps embodied through him, is Horus. For Narmer, for Hor-Aha, and for other rulers, at the dawn of the First Dynasty, the seric was a way of saying that kingship was not merely personal power. The king was not just the strongest war leader, the wealthiest estate owner, or the head of a successful family. His rule belonged to the divine order, or at least that is what the symbol claimed. The Horus falcon, perched above the palace facade, did not prove that everyone in Egypt accepted the king's authority. No image can do that, but it made the claim visible, repeatable, and difficult to ignore. On a jar stopper in Abydos, on an object from the delta, on a vessel moving through a storehouse, the same message could appear again and again. This palace belongs to Horus. This king rules under Horus. This shipment, this estate, this act of administration exists within the king's world. That repetition may have been one of the quiet engines of state formation. Power is stronger when it can be reproduced, not only through soldiers or ceremonies, but through routine. A seal pressed into wet clay, a royal name cut into ivory, a palace sign on a container, hundreds of small acts, performed by people who may never have seen the king, but who handled objects marked with his authority. Writing did not create the Egyptian state by itself. Armies, alliances, trade routes, farming surplus, local elites, religious institutions, and control of labour all mattered. But writing gave the growing system something new. It gave it durability. A spoken order disappears when the speaker leaves. A marked tag remains. A seal impression can be checked. A royal name can be copied. Information can move farther than memory, and authority can reach farther than a human voice. But there is a problem. The earliest written record does not tell us Egypt's whole story. In fact, it barely tries to. These tiny inscriptions overwhelmingly concern the concerns of elites. Kings, royal estates, offerings, goods, ceremonies, expeditions, victories and control. They do not explain what most farmers thought about unification. They do not record every conflict, every local ruler, every marriage alliance, every famine, every act of resistance. They rarely paused to introduce the people whose labour filled the storehouses in the first place. Writing was selective from the beginning. It preserved what the palace wanted counted. It named what the palace wanted remembered, and it left enormous spaces silent. That silence is part of why the founder of Egypt's First Dynasty can seem so elusive. We have royal names, but not always clear stories. We have images of conquest, but not a complete account of what happened. We have labels that preserve a king's presence on jars and goods, while the lives of thousands of ordinary people vanish almost completely. The king enters history first, not as a biography, not as a man speaking in his own voice, but as a sign above a palace, a falcon, a name enclosed in a frame, and the beginning of a state teaching the world, one little label at a time, who was in charge. But if writing gave the king a kind of durability, it did not give him immortality. A name on an ivory tag can survive for 5,000 years. Or it can disappear in a single bad season. Wood rots. Leather dries out, cracks, and turns to dust. Papyrus is eaten by insects, damaged by moisture, burned, reused, or simply thrown away. Mud brick walls dissolve when water reaches them, tombs collapse. Graves are robbed, temples are rebuilt. Old stone blocks are carried away and used in new buildings. The past does not vanish only when somebody wants it to vanish. Most of the time it vanishes because the physical world is relentless. This is important when we ask whether Egypt's first founder was erased. The word erased makes us imagine a dramatic scene. A later king sends workers into ancient tombs, names are chiselled off monuments, statues are smashed, records are destroyed because someone powerful wants a rival forgotten. And Egypt did sometimes do things like that. Later pharaohs occasionally attacked the memories of predecessors. Names could be hacked from inscriptions, images could be damaged, entire reigns could be omitted from official king lists. The Egyptians understood that memory was political. To remove a king's name was, in a sense, to attack his continued existence. But Narmer's case is not so simple. There is no clear evidence that some later ruler launched a systematic campaign to destroy Narmer's memory. In fact, Narmer was not completely lost. His name survived on objects from his own age. His Seric appears on ceilings, pottery, and inscriptions. His famous palette, discovered at Hierakonpolis, preserved an image of royal power so striking that it still shapes how people imagine the birth of Egypt. Narmer is archaeologically visible. Menes is literarily famous. And those are not quite the same thing. Narmer's name comes to us from objects made close to his lifetime. They are small, often broken, often found far from their original setting. But they are direct. A seal impression carrying his Seric does not tell us everything about him. It does not give us his childhood, his motives, or a detailed account of unification. Still, it places a royal name in the material world of the earliest dynasty. Menes, by contrast, appears much later. Egyptian king lists and later historical traditions remembered a founder called Menes, the king credited with joining Upper and Lower Egypt and establishing the first great royal order. Greek and Roman writers repeated versions of the story. For later generations, Menes was the beginning, the first king, the man who turned many communities along the Nile into one kingdom. But later memory often prefers a clean beginning, Real history is usually messier. Perhaps Egypt was unified through a single dramatic conquest. Perhaps Narmer won a decisive struggle and his victory became the foundation story. But perhaps political control developed in stages across several reigns. Local rulers may have been absorbed gradually. Marriage alliances, trade, religious influence, control of river routes, and selective warfare may all have played a part. A kingdom can be born through many small pressures before one ruler becomes the name attached to the result. Think of it like a river joining the sea. From far away, it looks like one clear moment. The river ends here, the sea begins there, but close up the shoreline is a maze of channels, marshes, mudflats, and shifting water. There is no single line. There are many lines changing with the season. The memory of Menes may work in much the same way. Later scribes compiling king lists were not modern historians with access to complete archives. They were working with traditions, royal records, religious ideas, and political assumptions formed centuries after the First Dynasty began. They may have compressed several early rulers, or several stages of unification, into one ideal founder. That does not mean Menes was invented from nothing. It means the name may have become larger than one man. Maybe Menes was Narmer, maybe he was Hor-Aha, Narmer's likely successor. Maybe the name preserved a title, a personal name, or a memory of a king whose identity later became tangled with the rulers around him. Egyptologists still debate the question because the evidence allows possibilities, but not certainty. And uncertainty can feel like erasure. We look for a founder and find a falcon above a palace facade, a triumphal palette, a few labels, tombs disturbed by robbers, objects scattered from their original homes. Then, centuries later, a famous name rising from king lists and historical tradition. Narmer stands close to the beginning but speaks in fragments. Menes speaks loudly in later stories but remains hard to grasp. So perhaps history did not try to erase Egypt's first king in the simple sense. Perhaps time did most of the work. Time, decay, robbery, rebuilding, selective record-keeping, and the natural human desire to turn a complicated beginning into a single memorable hero. But that does not make the mystery smaller. It makes it more human. A state was forming. Kings were claiming the two lands. Names were being written into clay and ivory for the first time. And already memory was choosing what to preserve, what to simplify, and what to leave in darkness. The founder was not fully forgotten. He was transformed. And this is where modern Egyptology enters the story. Not as a group of people arriving with a final answer. More like detectives walking into a room that has been flooded, burned, robbed, rebuilt, and left open to the desert for 5,000 years. They are not looking at a complete archive. They are looking at fragments. A broken jar with a royal sign scratched into it, a lump of dried mud once pressed against a storeroom door, a small ivory label with only a few symbols remaining, a tomb whose contents were disturbed in antiquity, then disturbed again by early excavators, then divided among museums on different continents. Every object has a story, but first scholars have to figure out whether it is telling them a story about the ancient past, or about everything that happened to it afterward. That distinction matters. Take the Narmer Palette. It is one of the most famous objects from ancient Egypt. A king wears the white crown of Upper Egypt on one side, the red crown of Lower Egypt on the other. He raises a mace over a kneeling enemy. He marches before decapitated bodies. At the centre, strange long-necked creatures are held by attendants, their necks intertwined around a circular hollow. It looks like a historical photograph carved in stone. A victory scene, a before and after one king conquers one enemy and creates one united Egypt. But ancient art is not a photograph. It is closer to a political statement, a royal claim made visible. The king is shown larger than everyone else because he is more important, not necessarily because he was physically enormous. Enemies are shown helpless because that is what enemies are supposed to be in royal art. The crowns may refer to territories under control, territories claimed, or an ideal of unity that kings wanted everyone to recognize. The palette may preserve memories of real conflict. Many scholars think it probably does, but it may also combine several events, symbolic enemies, religious ideas and royal ambitions into one carefully designed image. Think of it like a modern campaign poster. A poster may show a candidate standing before a flag, surrounded by cheering supporters, with a slogan promising unity, strength, and renewal. It tells you what that candidate wants people to believe. It may be connected to real events, but nobody would treat it as a neutral record of every meeting, argument, compromise, and failure behind the campaign. The Narmer Palette works in a similar way. It is evidence. Powerful evidence, but evidence still has to be questioned. Where was it found? What kind of object was it? Was it used in daily life, placed in a temple, or made as a ceremonial offering? Which images resemble earlier symbols? Which images appear again under later kings? Does the object show an event, a ritual, or a claim about how the world should be ordered? Those questions can change everything, and the same is true for names. Early Egyptian kings often had several names, titles, and ways of being represented. A ruler's Horus name appeared inside the Seric, the palace-shaped frame topped by the falcon god. But later king lists used different naming traditions. A name recorded centuries afterward may not look anything like the name found on a seal impression from the king's own lifetime. So when scholars ask whether Narmer was Menes, they are not simply matching letters. They are trying to connect two different systems of memory. One system is immediate and material. Clay ceilings, pottery inscriptions, tomb labels, objects made by officials who were managing grain, oil, cloth, animals, taxes and burial goods in the first generations of the Egyptian state. The other system is later and literary. King lists compiled long after the First Dynasty, temple traditions, stories repeated by Egyptian priests and Greek writers, memories organized into a neat line of rulers, each one following the last. Sometimes those systems overlap beautifully, sometimes they do not. Then there is chronology, which sounds dry until you realize that it controls the whole story. Did Narmer rule before Hor-Aha, as most reconstructions suggest? Was Scorpion II a direct predecessor, a rival ruler, or a king from a separate but connected political world? How long did the process of unification take? A generation? Several generations? A century or more? The difference matters. If unification happened quickly, then the image of a single conquering founder becomes more plausible. If it happened slowly, then Narmer may have been the ruler who inherited a process already far advanced, then gave it a more permanent form. And dating Egypt's earliest centuries is difficult because there are so few written dates. Later Egyptians sometimes counted years by major events, but this system was not yet the smooth calendar historians wish they had. Archaeologists often have to build chronology from pottery styles, tomb sequences, imported goods, seal designs, radiocarbon dates, and the layers of soil in which objects were found. No single method is perfect. Radiocarbon dating gives ranges, not magic timestamps. Pottery styles can spread through trade or imitation. Tombs can contain heirlooms older than the burial itself. Objects can be moved by robbers, floods, animals, or later construction. So, scholars compare methods. If a royal seal appears in a tomb, they ask whether the tomb was sealed during the burial or whether the sealing entered later. If a jar has a king's name, they ask whether it was made for that king, reused under another ruler, or sent as an old container from a distant storehouse. If an object comes from an early excavation, they return to the field notes, maps, photographs, and museum records, looking for details that earlier researchers may have missed. Sometimes the most important discovery is not a new tomb. Sometimes it is a forgotten box in a museum storeroom. A label excavated more than a century ago can be photographed again with sharper equipment. Faint signs can be examined under different light. Digital scans can reveal shallow scratches nearly invisible to the eye. Microscopic analysis can identify pigments, tool marks, resin, fibres, or traces of use. Chemical testing can show where stone, pottery, clay, or metal may have come from. Suddenly an object that once seemed silent begins to speak a little more clearly. Not clearly enough to give us Narmer's private thoughts, but clearly enough to show connections. A vessel made from stone brought across the desert. A seal impression found far from the royal cemetery. A style of pottery appearing in a region once treated as separate. These details help scholars trace the reach of early kings, the movement of goods, and the slow construction of authority along the Nile. Even political boundaries are uncertain. Modern maps make Egypt look like a clean shape with firm edges. Early Egypt was not like that. It was a river kingdom in formation. Control may have been strong around royal centres, weaker in distant villages, negotiated in borderlands, and dependent on local leaders who had their own interests. A king could claim the two lands without every community experiencing that claim in the same way. This is why debates continue, not because Egyptologists know nothing, because they know enough to see how complicated the questions really are. They can test a claim. They can ask whether it fits the archaeological context, whether the material is authentic, whether a reading of a sign is supported by comparable inscriptions, whether an interpretation explains more evidence than it ignores. But responsible scholars also know when to stop. They say perhaps, they say probably, they say the evidence suggests. And those small words are not weakness, they are honesty. In the world of Egypt's First Dynasty, certainty is rare. But careful reconstruction is still possible, piece by piece, object by object, context by context, the outlines become clearer. Not a perfect story, a truer one, and maybe that is the real work of history. Not to force the past into a single clean answer, but to listen patiently to what remains, and to admit how much has been lost. But even fragments can reveal consequences, and the consequences of the First Dynasty were enormous. Whether Egypt was united in one dramatic conquest, or stitched together through years of war, marriage, trade, ritual and political bargaining, the rulers of this period created a framework that lasted for more than 3,000 years. That is the real inheritance. Not just a name on a palette, not just a king swinging a mace. A system before the First Dynasty. The Nile Valley contained powerful communities, regional traditions, local elites, and competing centres of influence. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt were connected by the river, by trade, and by shared religious ideas. But connection is not the same thing as government. The First Dynasty helped turn those connections into something more organised. A state could now claim resources from far beyond one town or one royal household. Grain, cattle, linen, stone, oil, wine, pottery, ivory and timber could be gathered, recorded, stored and redistributed. Officials could act in the king's name. Seals could close doors, mark containers, and identify goods passing through royal hands. This is one reason those tiny mud ceilings matter so much. They are not glamorous. Nobody puts a lump of cracked clay on a postcard. But they preserve the fingerprints of administration. A seal pressed into wet clay could connect a storeroom in the delta, a workshop in the south, and a royal tomb at Abydos. It could say, in the simplest possible bureaucratic language, this belongs to the king. This has been counted. This has passed through an official channel. Do not open it without authority. And that idea survived. Later pharaohs commanded vast systems of taxation, labour, building and trade. They sent expeditions into deserts for stone and minerals. They raised temples. They built pyramids. They supported armies and officials. None of that appeared fully formed in the reign of Narmer, Hor-Aha, or their immediate successors. But the foundations were being laid. The First Dynasty created habits of rule: count the goods, mark the containers, name the officials, record the deliveries, connect distant places to the palace. Make the king present even where he was not physically standing. Writing was essential to this process. The earliest Egyptian signs were not novels, speeches, or private diaries. They were often practical: names, places, products, ritual events, ownership, the beginnings of a system for making authority visible and durable. A spoken order disappears when the speaker leaves. A name scratched into ivory, inked onto a jar, or impressed onto clay can travel downriver. It can outlive the official who made it. It can be found 5,000 years later by someone who has no idea what the original order was, but can still recognize that a king once stood behind it. That is a strange kind of immortality, and Egypt's kings understood immortality very well. At Abydos, the royal cemetery became more than a burial ground. It became a sacred landscape of beginnings. The First Dynasty rulers were buried there, near the older royal dead of Upper Egypt, in tomb complexes filled with goods, inscriptions and the remains of rituals meant to sustain the king beyond death. Some of those burials were surrounded by subsidiary graves, likely containing retainers or dependents buried at the same time as the ruler. It is a disturbing reminder that the birth of the Egyptian state was not gentle. Royal power could demand loyalty beyond life itself. Yet Abydos remained important long after these first kings were gone. Later Egyptians associated the site with Osiris, lord of the dead. Pilgrims came there, kings built monuments there, ordinary people left stelae asking to share in the holiness of the place. By the Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom, Abydos had become one of Egypt's greatest religious centres. The First Dynasty kings may not have imagined all of that, but their tombs helped make the place sacred. Their dead bodies, their names, and their ceremonies became part of a landscape that later Egyptians continued to visit, reinterpret, and remember. The symbolism of unity endured just as strongly. The king of Egypt was not merely a ruler of one territory. He was king of the two lands, Upper Egypt in the south, where the Nile valley narrowed between desert cliffs, Lower Egypt in the north, where the river opened into the wide delta. Later pharaohs wore the white crown and the red crown. They used titles that joined north and south. They presented themselves as the one who maintained balance between the two lands, between order and chaos, fertility and drought, the human world and the world of the gods. This did not mean Egypt was always politically united. It was not. There were civil wars, rival dynasties, foreign invasions, and long periods when kings in one region had little control over another. But the ideal remained. Even when the country broke apart, reunification could be presented as a restoration of the proper order of the world. And that ideal reaches back to the First Dynasty, back to the paired crowns, back to the royal titles, back to images like the Narmer Palette, where a king appears in both the white crown of the south and the red crown of the north. This is why Narmer matters, even if we cannot solve every mystery around him. He is not simply a man trapped in legend, nor is he only a name recovered from mud, stone, and ivory. He stands in the narrow space between the two. There is physical evidence for Narmer. his seric on objects, his presence on the palette, his connection to the earliest phase of the unified Egyptian state. That much is real. We can hold some of it in museums. We can trace it in excavation records. We can compare it to the names of rulers who came before and after. But the Narmer of legend is harder to grasp. Was he Menes, the founder remembered by later Egyptians? Possibly. Many scholars think the identification is likely, though not certain. Was he the first king to unite Egypt? Perhaps, or perhaps he was the ruler who gave a final political form to a unification already underway. Did he conquer the north in a single campaign? The evidence does not allow us to say. The closer we get to Egypt's first king, the more he seems to recede. Not into nothing, into uncertainty, and perhaps that is fitting. A king who helped establish one of history's longest-lived civilizations cannot be fully erased. His name survives. His image survives. The institutions that emerged in his time survived for millennia, but the man himself remains partly hidden, behind ceremony, behind propaganda, behind later memory, behind 5,000 years of sand. And that is the final irony. For a king associated with the beginning of Egyptian history, Narmer is easier to find in the ground than in the stories later Egyptians told about their past. His name appears in material evidence, on the Narmer Palette, on seal impressions, on pottery and labels, in the royal cemetery at Abydos. The evidence is incomplete, fragile, and sometimes difficult to interpret, but it is physical. It was made in, or close to, his own lifetime. It gives us a ruler with a recognizable royal name, a place in the sequence of early kings, and a connection to the moment when Egypt was becoming one kingdom. Menes is different. Menes comes to us through later memory, through king lists, historical traditions, and writers looking backward across centuries and millennia. To them, he was the founder, the first king, the man who joined Upper and Lower Egypt and began the long chain of pharaohs. Maybe Narmer and Menes were the same person. Maybe Menes was a later royal name, a throne name, or a remembered version of Narmer's identity. Maybe the founder tradition drew together the achievements of more than one early ruler, turning a complicated generation of political change into the story of one decisive man. That happens more often than we might think. History likes clean beginnings. A kingdom is easier to remember if it begins with one king. A city is easier to celebrate if it has one founder. A revolution is easier to explain if one face stands at the front of the crowd. But real change is usually messier. It takes years, sometimes generations. It takes alliances that leave no written record, trade routes that slowly become political networks, marriages between powerful families, rival towns competing for influence, rituals that make a ruler seem larger than an ordinary person, officials learning how to collect goods, seal jars, count cattle, organize labor, and carry authority from one end of the Nile to the other. By the time Narmer appears in the archaeological record, much of that process was already underway, and after Narmer it continued. So perhaps history did not erase him in the simple sense. Perhaps it transformed him. The name Narmer survived in objects close to his own age. The name Menes survived in the grand historical memory of Egypt. Between those two names lies a gap of thousands of years filled with retelling, royal ideology, lost documents, damaged tombs, and generations of people trying to understand where their world began. Narmer may have become Menes, or Menes may have become the name given to a larger event. Either way, something real stood behind the tradition. A ruler or rulers at the edge of the First Dynasty. A society learning to turn local power into state power. A new kind of kingship claiming to unite the two lands. The first small signs of writing carrying names and commands beyond the reach of the human voice. And 5,000 years later, those signs still speak. Not clearly, not completely, but enough. A carved palette shows a king wearing 2 crowns. A seric preserves a name. A tomb chamber lies beneath the desert at Abydos. A broken seal, a wine jar, an ivory label, a fragment of bone or stone. Tiny survivals from a world that should have vanished entirely. The king history could not fully keep is still there. Not waiting for us to solve him once and for all, just waiting, quietly, in the spaces between the evidence. If you enjoyed this journey into Egypt's earliest dynasty, please like the video, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. And let me know where you're listening from tonight. It is always wonderful to see how far these ancient stories travel. And if you would like to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify through the link in the description. For now, rest easy. Somewhere beneath the sand at Abydos, the first kings remain silent, but they are not entirely forgotten.